an assistant professor in Africana Studies here at Rutgers-Newark, and I'm really excited to be here in conversation with Kameelah, Janan, Rasheed. Everyone else, welcome to the I'm a co-curator of the exhibit Powers of the Unseen that's showing here in Express Newark right now, and I wanted to kind of share a little story to help set the table, if you will, for this discussion. This show has been a long time in the making. It's been a labor of love, about 3 years, and so a lot of discussions and research has gone into it. But at one point, we were kind of nearing the end of the preparations for the show, and we were thinking about which image or which work, which artwork we wanted to kind of be the signature image of the show. That's can be a very vexing kind of question, right? You have all these artists doing a lot of different things. You'll see in the exhibit, if you haven't already, there are a lot of different kinds of works. But soon as I realized that, okay, we needed to have this signature image, for me, it was no question. It had to be one of the 31 photographs from Kameelah, Janan, Rasheed's Spirit series. And for many, it might not be an obvious choice. It's very abstract, actually. This image above us is the one that we chose. We looked at a few different options from the series, but the curators thought that in so many ways it captured something fundamental about what we were trying to do with the show, of kind of achieve a kind of literal abstraction, right? A literal abstraction, and more generally a kind of attitude toward art and creative work and process that I think Kameelah's work embodies. And so with that said, I just want to read a quote that comes from something Kameelah said in a short documentary. I think many of you in the class have seen it, The Edges of Legibility, on the kind of the Art 21 webpage. Quote, "I like to play with language and making something either very, very legible or making something very, very opaque, and encouraging people to do the work of understanding it. It's really an invitation. Come think with me." And so in that spirit of invitation and welcome, I want us to welcome again Kameelah, Janan, Rasheed. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So I'm hoping that maybe we could start by just, if you can share with us the story of your name.
Oh yeah, I definitely can. So in like 1981, 1982, my dad converted to Islam. He changed his name to Kamal Salim Rasheed. And I was the first daughter after my eldest brother. And I was my dad's junior. So I'm actually named after my dad, Kamal being the male version, Kameelah being the female version. And then Rasheed, my dad was very focused on choosing a name that he could give to his family, give to his kids that in some way spoke to the sense of being guided. And then my middle name, Janan. I was told for a long time it meant heart and soul, which it obliquely does. But a couple of years ago I started looking for the Arabic root. And I was like, I can't find it. Like, there's nothing for this. And I remember calling my dad. He was like, yeah, we kind of spelled it not the right way, which is what makes it difficult for you to find the Arabic root. And the root ended up being Jim, which sort of speaks to something that is covered or veiled or sort of withheld from the senses. And I thought about that for a long time because I thought about the sort of meta irony of a name that meant a covering, something that's hidden, something that's sort of like withdrawn from senses. And for me not to have a sense of that name for most of my life. And so I'm really interested now in how that almost mistaken an unknown namesake has impacted the way that I think about my work and the way that I sort of present or show up in the world.
Yeah, so I want to pursue that. I think
Yeah.
there's something fundamental about your art practice that is both tied to the meaning of your name, the story of your name, and it's revealing to you. Could you speak to kind of how you've come to understand the relationships across those kind of elements?
Yeah, so I think a good starting place is that I sort of come into my work as an educator. I was a high school teacher for most of my life, and then I went to curriculum development, and now I teach graduate students. But what was always core in sort of my pedagogical approach is that I don't give students answers, but I give them sort of a context or a scaffold to generatively sort of struggle. And so I think in a lot of ways, revelation is sort of like a generative struggle for a prophet or for someone. You're going through a sort of struggle where information is being sort of given to you, offered to you, but it's not decoded yet. And so for me, I think about learning as an opportunity to give, like an opportunity to students and thinkers, learners all around to sort of patiently sort of wade with uncertainty. And so I think that for me, sort of taking that principle of like revelation or slowly accumulating understanding is sort of how I think about my practice too. I'll put work out that I don't fully understand yet, not because, sometimes it's a deadline, but sometimes, a lot of times it's literally because I don't think that transparency is necessary for sharing. I think that you can share something as you're still tinkering, as it's still coming to focus. I like the idea that I can do some sort of like revelatory work, the artist can do a bit of revelatory work, the work can be created, and then after that stuff can still happen. That revelation is a durational process, and it doesn't need to like happen all at once.
This strikes me as a profoundly Islamic theme.
Yeah.
Yeah, could you kind of help us through that without giving us the answer necessarily?
Yeah.
But kind of guide us through that.
I mean, I think for folks who are Muslim and who grew up with parents who woke you up to both pray and to read, my dad had this very particular thing where he would wake us up to pray, and then we would have Arabic studies lessons, and then we'd have Quranic studies lessons, and my dad would make like a almond butter. My parents were sort of hippies. They got like raw almond butter from the health food place with bananas, but that was like our morning sort of thing. And the stories that I remember the most were about Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, his revelations. And the amount of doubt that was part of that, right? Like this idea that something has come to him to give him something and he can't make sense of it. So he goes to Sister Khadija, asks for some clarification, and is still in this moment of doubt. And so I think in a lot of ways, the first revelation being sort of this implication or invitation to read, to recite, to be in sort of this discourse feels very important to me. And I remember as a kid, my parents being like, your actual responsibility in this life, in this dunya, is to learn. And so I think revelation for me, both in the context of a prophet or a student who's just like in class figuring stuff out, is a spiritual practice. It is a spiritual choice. It is a willingness or a disposition to be open in a certain way where you can receive information even if it doesn't make sense to you. Because I always think like, what if some of these prophets were like, I don't make any sense, keep it pushing, like they just carried on with their day. And I think this is sort of an important lesson for me around what do we do with uncertainty, or what do we do with something that's beyond our current state of comprehension.
I mean, there's so much that you're saying in all of this, and I kind of want to slow us down. You said something along the lines of generative struggle. Generative struggle, and that's just ringing in my ears, it's echoing in my ears. And what I'm associating with that phrase is the Arabic term ijtihad, right? Which is a kind of exertion, an intellectual exertion, often used in association with kind of legal reasoning, right, in the Islamic tradition, but has also been used to describe the kinds of innovative thinking that the modern age requires of Muslims, right? And you know, not totally surprising that it shares a root with jihad, right? Which is a word we often think of with as struggle, and so I'm curious if you kind of see any connections between kind of that kind of Islamic concept of ijtihad, which is absolutely tied to learning
Mm-hmm,
and more general forms of struggle.
Yeah, I was giving a talk at Concordia University with Mariam Kashani, who wrote a really beautiful text about, it's called Medina by the Bay, which is about sort of the growth of Islam in the Bay Area, where we're both from. And she was describing herself, and I always describe myself like I'm a learner and an educator, blah, blah, blah. And when she spoke, she said, oh, I'm a seeker. And that language immediately brought me back to sort of like Islamic traditions around how we think about knowledge as a process of seeking. Which for me is very different than acquisition. Seeking sort of prioritizes the process of doing a thing, whereas I think that a lot of the ways that we have been sort of conditioned around learning has been about the acquisition of a degree or the acquisition or capture of knowledge. And so I think that when it comes to questions around struggle, I think that anything that you sort of get out of life that is too easy or it's sort of given to you, you don't actually learn from. And so when I think about sort of the lessons or the information that stuck with me the most, it's because it was difficult for me to retrieve in some capacity, or it was difficult for me to accept in some capacity. It was difficult for me to even know that I needed it. And so I think that struggle, even though we don't like difficulty, is an important part of like learning, because it sort of conditions us to not only pursue the things that are easy, but it also sort of reminds us of the rewards of like actually doing something that's hard. And I'm thinking about this in the context of like the time of the prophet and like the struggles of what it meant to prophesize at a time where you were not very popular, and then also thinking about this contemporary moment where we are flooded with a range of news sources and a range of information, are constantly trying to fish to figure out what is there. And I always like to say to myself, in this context of like, the lowest hanging fruit is probably the worst information. And so this also idea for me of like having to struggle to get toward accurate information so that I can make grounded decisions about my life, about my students, about my family. But I think the struggle is an important sort of aspect of conditioning your spirit and your body to do a certain type of longitudinal and like long-term work.
I mean, so we're talking about these, this kind of Muslim upbringing that you've had, and its imprint on you and its influence on your work and the Islamic themes. I'm wondering to what extent in your kind of practice of the artist, I feel a little bit embarrassed because there were all these awards I was going to read out about you, and we just jumped right into it without really preparing you all. But to what extent do you think that your reception as an artist kind of appreciates, values, recognizes, even can understand this really important dimension of your work?
Like to what extent people are receiving me in that way? Just
so as you kind of navigate the art world, right? And which is, you know, kind of notoriously, if not a-religious, even anti-religious, right? I'm just curious, how does that, how do these themes and foundations that are so important to you show up or don't get to show up in the art world?
Oh no, everything will show up. That's not optional. I think, when I was 13, I started high school, and I went to a Catholic high school as a Muslim kid, and it was a decision that I very clearly made. It was the best high school in the Bay Area. All the students went to the best college. I was like, that's where I want to go. And so I think in a lot of ways, I've been often primed for experiences where I am one of the only Black people, one of the only Muslims. And so I think for me, there's never been a sense of like, I can't take all of me with me into a space or into a project. I think more of the response is like, how sad for you that you wouldn't get all of me. You can either take part, like all of me or none of me. And so I think that definitely sort of helps me carry myself in a particular way as an artist, where I never want to dismiss or discard or marginalize some aspect of my practice in the pursuit of like art notoriety, because I think it's very easy to be like, the easiest thing for me to do would be like to sort of blend in to figure that out, but I don't really have that muscle, and I think it's been important for me to implicitly sort of talk about the ways in which spirituality and art come together. I wouldn't say it's like easy, like if you're not outside all the time, that makes it very difficult to be part of the art world in a very particular way. But I'm satisfied, I feel good. I sincerely believe that what's supposed to come to me will come to me, and there's no amount of me sort of compromising, that's going to get me closer or further away.
So, over the past couple of days, I've been kind of listening to a few of your interviews and podcasts and things, and I've noticed in a lot of your discussions, you talk about your childhood. It's such an important kind of part of the way you understand your work, as I've kind of come to notice. And I wanted to kind of read something because separately, in kind of different roles that I'm in, I've encountered, re-encountered the Brazilian theorist of education, Paulo Freire, multiple times in the past 3 days. And the last time it came up, there was a quote at the same time that I was hearing this kind of recurring pattern in your work, and so I want to take advantage of just the connection between what's kind of coming through my filters and what I was hearing in your work. So Freire writes, "The more we become childlike again, to keep ourselves childlike, the more we can understand that because we love the world and we are open to understanding, to comprehension, that when we kill the child in us, we are no longer." In a number of your interviews, you talk about this child who was always writing, always making, always exploring. I think you wrote several books as a child. Could you just kind of respond to this passage and how you kind of think about it in these stories that come up for you?
Yeah, I mean, this is like very raw, because I'm thinking about the news that I got last week in connection with this, and I think in a lot of ways, growing up pre sort of like devices, computers and all those things, there was sort of this opportunity to always be doing something very tactile with your body. So if you wanted to play, you could go outside. If you wanted to figure out some research, you could figure out how to get to the library and pick up a book. And so I think that part of having been able to grow up in that context meant that I sort of got to witness this transition out of like very tactile things into more digital and ephemeral things. But I think it sort of taught me to like really enjoy learning as like a solitary process, but also as a group process. And so I think when I was a kid, I was not picking up the social cues around what was socially appropriate. So I was like, oh, we should definitely be playing board games at lunch, and we should definitely be asking for additional homework. And then I quickly realized that's not what you're supposed to do. But I think through all of that, there were adults in my life at that time who sort of like pulled me aside and were kind of like, hey, seems like you need something else to do. And so the publishing center became this place where an adult kind of like saw that I was sort of wandering and sort of untethered and unmoored, and sort of pulled me into that. I also had a science teacher, Mr. Barksella. He was the first black scientist I ever met. He was the first scientist I ever met, and he was my science teacher for most of elementary and middle school, and he would just let me do random experiments and just sort of like give me space. And so I think in a lot of ways, I was given opportunities to do a lot of play as a child, so much so that by the time I became an adult, and there was no interest in giving it up. In fact, I saw how good it felt to sort of wander. And so in a lot of ways, when I think about my own pedagogical practice or public programming that I organize, play is at the center, not in sort of like a frivolous way, because I do think that frivolity is also important, but also that the best learning that we can do is when we can take risks. And you can't take risks in academic environments or in social environments where you feel penalized. And so I feel like the first time that I actually feel like I take risks as a person, as a learner, was when I was playing. You're playing in this make-believe world, or you create this other scenario, you can take a risk. And so I kind of want to think about how that gets brought into everything that I do, providing enough space for people to generatively struggle and to take the type of risk that actually sort of amount to learning.
Yeah. And so learning is a really key word for you. You describe yourself as a learner, and as I'm understanding, play is at the very center of learning for you. You've also mentioned just now kind of two possible directions that I hope we both get into.
Yeah.
One is the kind of engagement with text and textuality, kind of a pet theme of mine that I would love to explore. But also another track I think would be interesting is this idea of science and technology. Which would you like to talk about first? Yeah, absolutely. Let's play a little bit.
Ooh. Okay. There's only two options. It shouldn't be this difficult. Let's do text.
Okay.
Yeah.
Beautiful. So you talked. Could you tell us the story of your father's study of Islam?
Yeah, so I was giving a talk at Brown in 2019, and I was sharing this new book I published. And I was going through slides, and this girl raises her hand, and she's like, "What does your dad have to do with your work?" And I was like, "What are you talking? I was like, girl, what does this have to do with him?" And I kind of got frustrated and flustered, and she was like, "Go back a couple of slides." And I had gone back a couple of slides, and in that moment, I realized that the way that I sort of make books, collage, organize information, is a one-to-one to my dad's notes when he was converted to Islam in the early 1980s. He was in pharmacy school at UCSF at the time, and he would come home from pharmacy school, flip over his notes, and he would photocopy different parts of religious texts and then collage them together to sort of take these notes. Like this giant sort of like dense sheet of paper that had like cutouts and his Arabic writing and his annotations and this and that, and things taped together. And I remember seeing them casually as a child. And then 15 years ago, I went home and I saw this like maroon binder, and I was like, "Can I take it?" And so in a lot of ways, the way that I approach text is never sort of like a single instance. There's sort of a relationship to revision or a relationship to returning to what I've been calling the scene of like presumed certainty, that my dad would keep coming back to the same sort of sheet of paper to keep writing on top of it, or come back to the same set of papers to keep working on it. And I think that sort of like gave me this impression that text was not fixed, that text was fluid, that text had its own sort of interiority that I had to respect and be mindful of. And it was actually my sacred responsibility to always revise. And if I'm not revising, it means that I'm not learning. If I'm not learning, the thing that my parents told me was my main responsibility on this planet, I've not fulfilled. And so I see revision as sort of this cue that I'm actually doing the work that I'm supposed to be doing in the world, because I'm willing to admit that I was wrong about something, or I was willing to admit that I was narrow-minded about something, that the revision is sort of a confessional act of actually coming to yourself and saying, like, there's another round of possibility here.
So the text is open.
It's open. There's Lynn Hydrogen has this essay, The Rejection of Closure, which talks about this idea of an open text, and tons of people talk about the idea of an open text. And I think that part of what's most fascinating to me about Islam and the ways that it was developed versus the ways that it's deployed now is this sort of insistence on the pursuit or the seeking of something, that you can read the Quran every Ramadan full straight through and still not have everything. There's one particular verse that I love that, on Fridays we're encouraged to read Surah Al-Kahf, and the second to last verse is something like, if the sea were my Lord's words, sooner would the sea be exhausted. Something to the effect of something about a sea. I'm thinking about it in Arabic. But basically, the sea is exhausted, but Allah's words are not. Which is a reminder for us that every time we think we know something, another sea or another flood of information is awaiting us. And so I kind of like the sort of positionality of thinking about text as open, but also text as invitational, and text as like a responsibility that you steward text, or you steward language, you steward knowledge. That is your responsibility.
Yeah. So my brain is on fire right now, because there are so many connections that you're making, and I'm thinking about the practice of tafsir, right? Of kind of, quite literally kind of opening up of scripture. It's used to describe a tradition of commentary.
Yeah.
But there's this sense of, fasara, of sort of opening up. But then also I'm thinking about, I was watching the documentary, the Arts 101 Edges of Legibility, and if you haven't seen it, highly suggested, and they kind of show images of the cutouts and the way that certain parts of the text would be cut out, and then there's commentary around it. And the text that is cut out, they're printed texts, right? Printed text. So this is a modern print technology, right? But then the relationship of the commentary, sometimes it's printed, sometimes it's handwritten. But what struck me is there's this practice in classical Islamic book writing and making of the spiral text, right? One of my old professors, Rick Messick, who's an anthropologist text, has studied this a lot, where the text, there's the main text, and then on the margins, the commentary, and then even some instances where you would have to kind of turn the text around to get different parts of the commentary, And so it was so interesting because I've only seen that in manuscripts, right? These old, hundreds of years old texts with handwriting. But your father was doing this with print. And I'd never seen that before. And now you have also kind of incorporated that into your art practice.
Yeah, I mean, I think so I didn't go to school to study art I was a policy major, so I thought I was going to go to DC, and that's long, 20 years ago. But anyway, I mention that because I think there's part of my practice that feels very intuitive, and so when people ask questions like, why would you arrange the text on a page like that? I'm like, oh, it just makes sense. Or I saw my dad do it, and then when someone brings up a historical reference, I'm like, oh, that's cool. That's sort of nice that I was connected to this sort of lineage of making text that I didn't know that I was associated or connected with. And so I think, and speaking about things that are unseen and veiled or sort of withheld from our sensory network, I think that it's been really exciting for me as an artist to not have an art or art history background or have a textual studies background, because I can happen upon these methods that just make sense to me and then go back and realize that it made sense to someone 700 years ago and be very interested in like, what about spiritual practice? What about like the way that our brain works makes that make sense? And so for me, it only makes sense that you would read something corporeally, that there may be information that's here because there's a different meaning when something is marginal, or the idea that if I turn something around, I'm getting multiple views, and even in that process of rotating, something is happening to my sort of thought process. And I think also like neurodivergence plays a lot into this, and like not knowing that information and getting that information as an adult, I was like, oh, that's why it made sense. Like that's why it made sense, and I was confusing to everyone else. But I think about this a lot in terms of like the importance of like sticking with something even if it's not clear to you, and not sort of giving up on it because it's difficult for other people to make sense of, or it's even difficult for you to make sense of. Because I think about had I disciplined my practice earlier on, I would not have produced the work that I'm making. I definitely got lots of cues to discipline a lot of what I was doing, but I'm happy that I stuck with it, because of moments like this, you're like, oh yeah, the manuscript we're doing. And I went to Catholic school, so I also now am remembering the marginalia in a lot of these books, and I've been spending the last several weeks looking at all these medieval Islamic diagrams. There's like a set from Sudan that's authored that I've been looking at, that is at the Wellcome collection. And then I've been looking at all Ibn Arabi's cosmological diagrams and just being sort of like floored, because they sort of work on the same principle of how text organized on the substrate of a page can be arranged in a particular way to evoke a particular feeling. And just, I don't know, I'm getting very excited about sort of the textual history of Islamic practice, not as something that's like medieval of the past, but as a very contemporary.
Yeah. And thinking about your works, I mean, just kind of looking at different examples, there's so many exhibits, right? And so many works that you've produced, but there's a certain recurring motif around the cutout text, kind of position and collage. Could you talk about just that as a practice? What are you thinking about when you are selecting and arranging and putting in place this text?
Yeah, I think the first thing that comes to mind is just like the implicit influence of my dad and my mother's sort of like note-taking process, that knowledge never comes from a single source, that you sort of corroborate that. And for them, I think the idea of literally compressing something to the same sheet of paper meant you would go grab this thing, cut it out, and put it on the sheet of paper. You would go grab this thing. And so I think there's a very clear sort of like learning practice for me, which is that your sheet should always sort of have tells from different places, right? And there was a moment where I got really obsessed with the platypus as like an animal because it's like a bizarre animal that is not neatly in any category of species and sort of shows its seams in a way that I really think is beautiful. And so I think that for me, the idea of cutting something and leaving a bit of like the edge on it is to say that I want to bring this thing from one context and put it in another, but I don't want that sort of carry over, that transversal, to erase the history of where it came from. And so in a lot of my works, even when I'm cutting out things, I may leave on some digital artifacting. I may leave on like the top of the line right below it as an indication that it came from somewhere. And when I'm looking for things to cut out, I sort of think about it in the same way that a musician might think about sampling. I'm not saying I'm going to use this immediately. I may just see a letter A that I'm like, that's a fly letter A, and I will screenshot that, or I will photograph it, or I will make a drawing of it and sort of save it.
So just the look of the A.
Yeah, like the actual physical characteristics of it. Like thinking about a letter, I think about letters and text in the same way that someone might think about a figurative drawing. Like I'm really paying attention to like the ligature, the curvature here, like the part of the R that sort of flicks upwards, or because something was Xerox, something being stretched out. All those sort of characteristics of text are intensely important to me, which is why I don't actually make work. I very seldomly make work that's just typeset text that I print out. It is always text that comes from somewhere else, an A from here, a B from here, a D from here, because I think there's something about what that letter actually carries as coming from another source and then coming into my work. But there's also something about digital artifacting and not wanting everything to become like a 4K flat screen, but for things to still have texture. And at this time with digital everything, the only way that I have been able to create texture is by leaving those textures in the work and not trying to sort of compress them or optimize them or render them more precise.
Mm-hmm. Textures of text.
Yes.
That's a poetic way of thinking about the practice. But also, I guess I'm thinking about stuff was just like the image of text, and not thinking of them about as language, right? Usually the default is thinking about writing as language, and it's kind of just so happens to be there. But not to make this too much of a recurring theme this night, but we also have this tradition in Islamic art of calligraphy, in which letters are very meaningful, not for their semantic, I mean there is a semantic importance, right? But also of their like visual, graphic beauty in calligraphy. And so there's that kind of Islamic art piece to it. Are you engaging with that at all, or it just happens to be there?
I think it happens to be there, and I think you bringing up these very clear historical references is very grounding for me. I can go back and tell my dad, like, look, things are connecting. So I would say for a long time, and so I would still say now, when people would approach my work, they're like, this is not Islamic work because I don't see green, I don't see foil, I don't see Arabic. And I'm like, first of all, not every Muslim speaks Arabic, and that's a whole other thing. We're not gonna do that now. But the whole point is like recognizing that we've also flattened the way that sort of Muslim artists can present their work and only being at one register. And so for me, the attention to sort of the shape of letters comes a lot from finding out that I really loved geometry when I was in high school. I struggled with math. Algebra was like, what is this? I got into geometry and something just clicked. Like I was just like, I understand this intuitively. Like you don't actually have to teach. I can figure this out, right? And so I think that when that was happening, I was also very interested in language, and I think something just sort of like merged there for me. That like a sentence can have a tangent, and that could be like a literal thing in the sense of like a sentence written, and then there's a tangent line where another sentence is written, or a sentence can have a tangent in the sense that like I'm saying something, there's a parenthetical that sends you off in another direction. And so I think for me there is sort of this interest in thinking about the relationship between geometry and the ways that letters and things show up, but also have been reading this book, the name is going to escape me, but it's a text about Ibn Arabi and his cryptographic Arabic script. And I've been really interested in that because he's sort of done a lot of work around like a letter having different life forms over time as it sort of travels through what position it is in a particular Arabic word, but also thinking about letters as being able to imbue something even more. So thinking about like the Roof movement and folks who are associating particular values with letters, or even Kabbalah within Judaism, this sort of association with letters and numbers and the shapes of things as having some other sort of meaning has really been interesting for me.
So Kameelah, I thought we were talking about text.
Yes.
But you're talking geometry, you're talking
yes.
cryptography.
Yes.
Right? It seems like you want us to go back to the science and
We can go back to the
question.
science, yeah.
Right? So, I mean, one of the things that I really adore about your work and so excited to be a part of the show is that I think one of the really unifying ideas or just facts about what you're doing is a kind of integration, right? A certain refusal to isolate. I mean, you mentioned the platypus and this species that can't be classified into the normal divisions, right? And I see you kind of doing that just now with what we were talking about with text, but at the same time talking about this question of science, of reality. So on the one hand, text, we're talking about representation, ultimately, right? But with science, it's like truth, which is beyond representation. That's something that we're trying to arrive to. You're saying, no, we have to actually hold these together, and they're connected, and you want us to pursue the connection. How do you manage to do that in your work when there's so much in our everyday lives that actually compel us not to make the connections?
Yeah, I mean, I used to work at a nonprofit where I was developing curriculum, and I would get in trouble in the sense of like, I would be like, we're writing this like social studies curriculum, but like, why don't we also talk about the ecosystem during the Industrial Revolution, because that'll really help kids understand like the impacts of blah, blah, blah. And it would always be like, this is social studies, this is not science, this is not that. My brain always wanted to make that leap, and I think there is some sort of like proto-connection to the fact that like, there was a point where these weren't siloed disciplines. There was a point where for you to make sense of anatomy, you also had to make sense of spirit. To make sense of spirit, you also had to make sense of math. There was a point where these were integrated. And so I think there's a particular part of me that like yearns for that moment of integration, where for me to make sense of the world required collaboration, not only from different disciplines, but from different people. The idea that for me to make sense of the world, I would need to talk to a spiritual leader. I would need to talk to a mathematician. I would have to talk to this person, that person. Those are all really important for me. And so the relationship I see with science all the time is that science is a politics and a poetics of revision, right? Like it is literally, even though it's not positioned as such, it literally is someone being like, I think this is a thing that makes sense, and then spending most of their life trying to figure out if it makes sense. It is a faith-based practice. Science is a faith-based practice. You are literally saying, I think photosynthesis happens like this. And I think so much so that it happens like this. I'm going to spend the next 30 years of my life creating small diagrams to explain photosystem 2 and photosystem 1, right? And so I think that for me, I've had this question when I was doing a show in Germany where someone's like, I see all this Islamic stuff and all this math and science stuff, do you find any conflict? And I was like, no, we're all here speculating. We're all trying to make a path. We're all trying to do sense making. And that is what the purpose of like learning is. Science is here for us to support a sense making. And where science cannot pick up something, we have other disciplines that can pick it up. And for a more holistic understanding of the world, you can pick up everything. So I've been a strong advocate of like any time that I'm even teaching, I'm teaching a class now, it's a text-based practices class where we spend time talking about quantum physics. Why? Because you need to understand elements of quantum physics to understand how language works on a page, or to understand the pace of something being transmitted to another location. These are important aspects to have a real deep understanding of anything. And I think at this point, we are siloed because it is politically advantageous to have people not integrate ideas, or to not even just build connective tissue. Because then you'd be like, you don't know that thing over there, that's cool. You don't know that thing over there. So you can't actually build solidarity when we're siloed. And so I think that pulling things together, not making them the same, but pulling them together to be in conversation is a move toward a certain type of political solidarity that is discouraged, but is absolutely necessary.
Word. Word. That is, this is really doing a lot for me in my thinking right now. And I want to talk about quantum physics.
Ooh, okay.
But first, I want to talk about another.
I'm so excited. Yes, go ahead.
Another Islamic concept of the algorithm. Can you talk to us about algorithms and computing and your kind of thinking through both kind of this deeper history of computing and also kind of where we are today in face of the algorithm?
Yeah, so as context, I grew up in the Bay Area in what is now considered Silicon Valley, and Facebook/Meta is like 10 minutes from my parents' house. And because I was like an early 90s kid in that area, you ended up testing a lot of stuff. You didn't realize you were testing a bunch of stuff. It was like random computers at school, you would figure stuff out. And so I spent a lot of time from like age maybe 8 upwards on computers playing with systems, trying to figure out how things worked. And one of the pieces of software that I loved the most was something called Hyper Studio. It was basically like the early internet where you could build your own tiny internet in the context of a couple of these things called cards. You would make a card, it would have some information, but you make a button, and that button would send you to another card. You would just build this sort of hypertext through all these cards. And I think that was the first time that I sort of thought about like knowledge as something that can sort of like move or transport to another place and be shared more widely. But it also got me thinking about sort of questions of an algorithm that limits your scope of like what is accessible or what is visible or what is known. And so that sort of more advanced thinking doesn't come until much later. But I think now in my adulthood, spending time coding and doing all these things as a kid, now in my adulthood I'm really curious about like the algorithm as like a poetics that enters all contexts. Like the algorithm of like a classroom also implies that there's a certain expectation around how things are supposed to go, and the breaking of the algorithm can lead to reward or to punishment, but I like to think about the algorithm as a constraint that can be generative, but also a constraint that is possibly invisible or not clearly perceptible in ways that we keep repeating the same sort of pedagogical tropes. We keep repeating the same sort of like political ideas because we're stuck in the loop of a particular algorithm.
So, thinking about this being stuck in algorithm, I mean, I'm as a university professor, my interaction with algorithms are both seen and unseen, right? So some of the more apparent, more visible interactions are, with ChatGPT, right? And with kind of automatic writing, right? But there are also these unseen algorithms, right? Which is kind of what I'm hearing you say about these repetitions that we're compelled to be repeating that show up in the way my students sit in the classroom, right? The way in which they are often, to me, seem very disempowered, right? In their learning process, right? In a certain sense that there is no other alternative, right? And that's a less obvious algorithm. And I've come to understand the apparent algorithm that a lot of us instructors are kind of sort of freaked out by are only possible because of the unseen ones.
Yes. The
right?
unseen making the,
And I'm just curious, kind of, as an artist who's engaged with technology, some of your work is kind of in computing, how do you kind of view the most recent developments of like artificial intelligence in particular, and what's your sense of it, and how do you want to engage or not engage?
Yeah, so in 2020, I was invited to do this class at a place called the School for Poetic Computation, which I thought was funny because I hadn't done any like computing for quite some time. But it sort of opened up a lot of interest for me around like chance and sort of predictability. And so in 2022, I have this fellowship with Google, which was like artists in machine learning, where I was sort of playing with text image generation. That's literally typing in a scene or a sentence or whatever the case may be, and then seeing what this trained neural network can produce from that. And this is 2022, so this is early. This is before all the like crisp images we see now. It was rough. It was rough. It was a fun time though, I think. And I think that for me, when it comes to machine learning, there are two parts that feel important. I think thinking about the purpose of why you're using something. At the time, I was using it to sort of jam the system to figure out to what extent can it handle poetic language. And what I found out is that as much as it's been sort of positioned as like very intelligent thing, it's a very specific type of intelligence, right? So giving, at 2022, giving this Mid-Journey a sentence that is very poetic where things are not concrete and materialized, and seeing what it does, like it actually got confused. Like it was sort of like, do I put orange on top of the, like what happens? And I actually enjoyed that part as sort of a reminder of the importance of like human and non-human intelligence that is not connected to a computer. I think the other thing that feels important to me about machine learning is that part of stuff like ChatGPT and all these things is, I think it robs us, of this thing I spoke about before, which is generative struggle. If I go to ChatGPT and say, what is the connection between these three ideas, I don't have to actually tussle with the ideas in a way that I would have stumbled upon something else in the process. And so I think my main concern around machine learning is that it does this thing where it speeds through all these major cognitive steps where you like come to an idea, you abandon an idea, you come back to an idea, you're excited, you're sad, you dream about the idea. It erases that entire sort of like workflow for efficiency, and we understand why these systems are important because they make us being workers more efficient, right? And so the trade-off for efficiency in these sort of compressed contexts is that we have, we don't have surprise anymore. I think that's the thing for me is like this sense of surprise is taken from you because you have sort of given it away over to something that can do it more quickly for you. And so I think that like there are elements of machine learning that have been really helpful in my life in terms of being able to like automate things that I need for accommodations and things like that. But when it comes to creative practice, I think it's really important to struggle to arrive at a really, really bad idea on your own and to publicly talk about a really, really bad idea and then to come back like, it was a really, really bad idea. Like all of that sort of public revision is important and it gets edited out when we're trying to get to the answer, the easiest solution as soon as possible.
So I just realized it was a little bit later than I thought.
Oh, crap. Oh, wow.
And,
Yeah.
you know, I think that we could talk for a long time.
Yes.
A very long time. And I wouldn't want it to stop, but I don't want to monopolize your time with us. But I will ask one question before giving it over, which is kind of a compound question, so I know you're interested in connections. So to go back to quantum physics, I want to somehow, I don't know how to do it, but I'm sure you will. Could you connect dark matter with African and African diaspora history?
We're gonna do this? Yeah, no, I want to do this. Okay. Whew. I'm breathing because I'm like very excited about this. So Sarah Servinack, who I get to see this weekend, wrote a book called Black Gathering, where she's talking about the relationship between certain textual practices and notions of gathering and fugitivity and errancy and all these things. In chapter 2, she talks about two poets. One is Samia Bashir and the other person whose name is escaping me. But the whole chapter is actually about Black women poets in relation to quantum mechanics. And so when she gets to this sort of conversation around dark matter, she talks about dark matter as this thing that is present but an unseen force, right? I know dark matter is in the mix here because something else is not occupying that space. It is a presence that is acknowledged through its absence almost, right? Or our inability to see it. And so I think that in a lot of ways, this is a speculative connection I'm making now. For me, I think about dark matter very much in the ways that we were having this conversation just a moment ago, right? Of you being like, oh, did you think about this? Me being like, no, but that is still part of a lineage that I don't have access to, but is now available to me. And so I like to think about dark matter almost as like a vestigial, like or residual cultural things or cultural practices or intuitive practices that one might have that they can't name or like position perfectly, but they're there in the orbit, they're there under some sort of like attachment or tethering to you. And then she also, Sarah Servinack talks about dark matter in another way, which is like as counter surveillance, this idea that of being present but having the cover because light cannot make it seen. So this idea of having a method of counter surveillance, what it means to be present but not acknowledged, or present but not available. And I think Zora Neale Hurston gets into this in Mules and Men when she talks about like the the theory of black folks. She says like, no, white folks are coming around trying to collect folklore, and she's like, the Negro is very, very evasive. We like laugh and we like to send you on your way. And she says, you can read my writing, but you sure can't read my mind. So there's this element of like presence, like I'm here, like you know something is here, but you don't have access to the full interiority of it. And so this is a very speculative a rendering of this, but I think there's more there. I think also when it comes to things like black holes and accretionists, I think there's some other, anyway,
Right.
yeah.
Well, thank you for going there with us, speculatively, which is one of my favorite modes. But I do want to open up the conversation. You know, we've given you quantum mechanics, we've given you some Islamic theology, we've given you history, we've given you art and text. So hopefully there's something for everyone in the room to engage, and we would love to hear your voice in this conversation.
Hi, my question is, before you start a work, do you usually like have a set theme or story you want to tell, or is it just further exploration? Like, can you tell me more about like your process when you start a work?
My process is very frustrating to curators because they'll be like, we have a show, and I was like, great. And I'm like, okay, so leave me alone for 2 years and then come and talk to me. And I think part of that has a lot to do with not wanting to over-determine my work so much by saying the work is going to be about this, because then it literally closes off what I'm paying attention to. So I have very poor sensory gating, which means that any stimuli that's happening, I got it, I'm pulled it all in. And while it's very distracting and difficult, it also means that like when I'm trying to come up with ideas for projects, I'm not just in this world of like the arts. I'm constantly being like, oh, that was interesting how that plant grew in the direction of this other light source, or that was interesting how blah, blah, blah. So I like to like give myself like a supple perimeter in the sense of like the work is in the sort of range of this, but I don't want to close it off too much because I don't want to run the risk of like missing something that's very generative. I think it depends on the timeline also. So if I'm collaborating, it's a very different process because there's a sense of certainty that you need to have and work with other people. But I think when I'm left to my own devices, I kind of like to wander. I had this show that's opening up in Germany about the Shakers in a couple of weeks, and I had sent a couple of months, I sent this whole thing to the museum, and they're like, it'll be next to this person's work. And then I sent them an email like 2 weeks ago where I said everything has changed dramatically, and they're like, oh, that is annoying. But part of that had to do was I kept leaving myself open. I started the work, didn't fully finish it because I knew something else was missing, and so I always try to leave a little bit of space for some sort of chance to come in.
So, as we were watching the video, for your interview, I noticed that you were using those photographic reels from old times in your
Old
artwork.
times, not that old.
Like,
I know, I'm just playing.
I just wanted to know what significance does that hold in your artwork?
Yeah, so I'll be 40 in like 4 months, and so for me, all my relationship to media is very physical. So I grew up with like a physical floppy disk. I grew up with like, everything was physical, and so for me, a lot of times in my practice, I like to go back to physical media versus being digital solely. And working with the 35 millimeter leader film, it allows for a bit of flexibility in terms of being able to paint directly on something and then scan it in and then do other things. And this is actually how these works were produced. I was working on like a video project on those materials, and I was trying to photograph them, and my camera was really, really bad. The scanner was bad, but I was like, oh, this could be interesting. And I just started jostling them as I was photographing them. So I kind of like tactile physical media because it allows me to play in a way that I would not be able to play if I'm sort of constrained to the interface of like Adobe or something else.
Hi. You had mentioned before that you would like to, when you teach, you don't really tell people the answer.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that that reflects in your work? Like, do you hope that your audience, you want them to really think rather than have a direct answer? Do you think that translates into your work?
Yeah, so I have a rule for all of life, which is I don't gather people unless the gathering unless what is possible through gathering people will be impossible if left to their own devices. So I don't want to invite people to come to a show if what they'll figure out in the show or what they'll see can be seen from their phone. So I like to think about installing work where there is some sort of element of, it can be documented, but there's an importance or reward in physically being there with the work. And sometimes it's not about my work. Like sometimes the reward is like you run into someone else at the show, or you see something that reminds you of something else that sends you somewhere else. And so I don't want to think about the work as like this rewarding experience where everyone is coming to learn a bunch of stuff. But I do really believe in the sociality of art and bringing people together in a space, because I do think that when people bump into each other intentionally, unintentionally in a given space while looking at art or engage in any other knowledge production process, something magical does happen. And so yeah, I don't like giving answers because I don't like when artists do that to me. I don't like when people insult my intelligence and assume that I can't figure stuff out. I like the puzzle, I like the quest. Yeah, I think quests are an important part of like existing.
A follow-up question.
Yes.
Does your pieces usually have like a meaning? Does it really have like something specific? Or because like when you
Specific as in like
you leave it open to interpretation for the viewer. Is there something that you are kind of hoping that they get from this, or you
I see what you
just
mean. Yeah.
yeah.
No. So there definitely are sort of like, I mentioned a supple perimeter before, there definitely is sort of a perimeter of things that I'm thinking about, right? But there have often been times where I produce work and I'm like talking about it, and then someone says something to me like, did you ever think about blah, blah, blah? And I was like, actually, no, I didn't. And so the next time that I'm thinking about the work, I'm installing the work, they become part of the work. I'm like, oh, in this talk that I gave, so-and-so said this, blah, blah, blah. So now the work is also sort of evolving alongside it. So there is sort of like, I'm interested in talking in this work in particular, thinking about the spiritual leader named Sister Gertrude Morgan down in New Orleans, who was engaged in the spiritual practice in relation to things in Islam around the seen and unseen. That is important, but other things that got sort of picked up that I didn't even think about, the history of photography in relation to this. That wasn't my immediate sort of like impulse. And so the work has a thing, but then the work also has other things through the sociology. It was like sitting together to discuss it.
Thank you.
Hi, I arrived a bit late, so if I'm asking anything that has already been covered, just ignore it. As I was looking at the picture again, I remember that at a certain point, I'm one of the co-curators. We noticed that the picture, this specific one, that we like found one online where it was flipped, and then one where it was not. Maybe it was just a mistake, but it did make me think about this, specifically this series.
Yeah.
Since also you see that things evolve. Is there a direction to that? And how do you decide?
Yeah, so when I made so this is like 31 are shown here, but there are like 1,000 of them that are like sitting in drafts. And when I made the work, I was so enamored with some of the shapes or some of the movement that I don't actually think I thought about orientation at all. I was like very like moved by the movement. And so this work has been shown like several times, but every single time it's been shown very differently. So like here it's in a grid, and the first time it was shown was in a grid, but the grid is slightly different here than it was the first time. There's a show that just that opened back in late December, early January of this year, where the work was sort of scattered throughout the space, where like one piece was sort of wrapped around the column and then found somewhere else. And that had a lot to do with the art handler that was there. We were talking about how we wanted to do it, and I was like, I don't want it to be in a grid. I kind of think I want to play with like things being sort of like scattered or errant, and so we spent a bunch of time sort of mapping this out. And so I really do like working with the folks who are at the institution to sort of figure out like, does this show of the work require something else? And in that instance, it did require something else. It required that people sort of like weave in and out of these shapes in order to get to it. So yeah, I'm always open to see how the work can be positioned differently in another context.
Hi.
Hello.
So in class and outside of class, I viewed your art, and it reminded me a lot of blackout poetry. And I wondered if, how blackout poetry, it also has the trend of opaqueness, like blocking out what you don't want seen, and just letting what is legible be seen. I wonder if like that's something that you incorporate into your work
Yeah, so blackout poetry isn't the immediate reference. I think that for me, I was gonna say embarrassingly, but I don't care. I love Emily Dickinson. I think she's amazing. I was reading a lot of Emily Dickinson at the time, and sort of gotten to her work that's unedited. So the stuff that she would write on envelopes, the stuff that she would write on the back of things. And I was fascinated by how she used the sheet of paper, like whatever substrate that was, to sort of distribute language across the page in a way that meant something. And so when I think about blackout poetry, I think there's a literalness that's not bad, right? Of like, I'm blacking out something and I don't want you to see it. But there's also this temptation that now that it's blacked out, I kind of want to know what it is. And I think that is one register of thinking about opacity. I think another register of thinking about opacity is things that are available for us to see but are not legible. And I think I'm more interested in that because I think that most of life is that, right? It's not so much that something is literally behind a dark cloak and we can't see it. It is that something is sitting right in front of us and we're struggling to decode it. And so I like to actually play with something being visible but maybe not available, or something being apparent in its form but not legible. Those are sort of important moments for me. And I think where I do enjoy blackout poetry is sort of the mechanics of redaction as sort of like a poetic inputable practice around information to be held onto, information to sort of diffuse. But yeah, I think I'm really interested in like the unseen not only being like unseen in terms of what you can see physically, but also what you can see spiritually, what you can see cognitively, what you can see and through other senses.
Thank you. Hi. Thank you so much for being here with us today, and thank you to our incredible curators and just hosting this conversation. I was really struck by what you both were talking about regarding the AI sort of part of the talk, and what you said about how AI eliminates the sort of creative space to grapple with ideas or to break down ideas. And I'm just curious, in this time that we're in now, a very complicated time, how you go about making space for the play that you're talking about, or just the love of learning that you're describing and explaining to us all, because I feel like that's missing. And I think us as creatives or academics or professors, curators, or however you define yourself in the space, students, it's really difficult to hold that. So if you can share anything about how to create and hold that space.
Yeah, I mean, I think I definitely run up against conversations where people are like, why are you talking about play in a dystopia? And I was like, you think we're gonna get out of this by being depressed? Like that's not a solution, that's not a real thing. And I think that for me, play comes in as sort of this like rehearsal. It is a rehearsal for how to be with people in another way, right? So like playing with people is not just like, I'm gonna play checkers. It's like, I am gonna play checkers with you, but I'm also gonna figure out how I deal with conflict, right? And I always tell people, if you're gonna take someone on a date, take them to an escape room. Figure out how they deal with conflict. Take your friends, take your partner, take them to an escape room, because I think a lot of times we think that political activism is like, everyone's showing up to rally, half of us don't know how to be with other people in very, very healthy ways, right? So you can have the most amazing political ideas, the most amazing political solutions, and not know how to talk to people in ways that are nurturing, and the message is completely missed, right? And so for me, play again is like this rehearsal. So I do a lot of play. I started like a tiny school, it's called the Little Octopus School, and basically it's like all organized around play. There's like a subscription service for people who want to get games in the mail. They're like little handmade games. There are sort of events for people who want to info dump but don't have people to info dump with. It's basically sort of like, how do I bring people in to community with one another in a way where they can learn how to take risk in how they're thinking, but also risk in just talking to people. And I feel like these last couple of years when we were in lockdown, I was like, damn, a lot of us don't have social skills. And some of us, like myself, are autistic, but like that's not all of us. So like, what's happening here, right? And so I think like, when I think about the Little Octopus School, there's this sense of like, bring people together as a way for us to rehearse other possibilities, as a way for us to figure out like what social configuration makes sense, but also I don't organize it with strangers. I don't, right? So the only way that I'm gonna ever be able to politically organize is with people that I know. How am I gonna get to know people if I'm not engaged in these other casual sort of interactions? Yeah.
Hello. So next week I'm going to be speaking and guiding students through the gallery. And so my question is there a question or experience that you would like to convey to the students to allow them to get into that space that you were speaking about, like generative struggle? How to engage with art in a way that generates those ideas for them, even if they may not necessarily connect with the themes, they can kind of get an introduction to the work.
Yeah, and this is maybe it's a slightly cop-out response. I'll say it anyway. I think that one of the most fun things that I've done in shows with like groups of people is inviting people to do like prompts, right? Of being like, go through the space and find a word, a shape, a blah, 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 bring it back, and then within your groups, try to make something out of it. And part of it has a lot to do with, I think that looking at art is difficult because we're expecting to have all these like answers. Like the artist is trying to like, I don't know, I sit in prints every week with my students. I'm like, you know, like none of us know. We just sit here talking for an hour and a half about what we thought was like, it is all speculation, it's all speculative work. And I think part of like speculative work is actually getting into the mess of it, which is actually playing with the thing. So if I pull a shape from one of my pieces and then there's a word in another piece, what could possibly happen? And I give my students this prompt every week, which is they get a list of artists for this text-based class that they have to explore some work, and I ask them to cross-pollinate. If this artist were to like make a work with this artist, what do you think would happen? So I like these sort of speculative exercises of getting people to get down to the nitty-gritty of maybe how an artist is thinking or how an artist is making, and then using that as sort of like a system to sort of think about how collaboration can come into play.
Thank you.
Hello, thank you so much for this conversation and for sharing your work with us for the show. So I teach art history, and so I'm always thinking like, wow, how can I incorporate this in my syllabus? So if you were on a syllabus for contemporary art, like 1975 to the present, say, what other artists, thinkers, writers, either before or after you, would you want to put on that syllabus for the students to better understand your work?
There's a Brazilian artist named Nede Sá. She created this work called Transperiência, where she took an acrylic cube and she printed text on it, and the only way to read it is by holding it up to the sun and sort of twisting it around. And so I think that any sort of like text-based artist that is engaged in some sort of play, John Furnival made like a game where it's like a box that had words on them, and you would turn these little turnstiles to create new sort of like combinations of things. But I think I'm really interested in like language and it being mercurial, and then sort of like the trickster element of that. And so a lot of that has to do not with like an artist who's making a work that looks a particular way, as much as an artist making a work that registers or interfaces with an artist or with other people in a particular way. So anything like game-based, Olipo, any like Dadaism, any of that sort of stuff, yeah.
Thank you.
So I think we're coming up on the hour.
Yes, I think we have time for maybe one, perhaps two more questions. Anybody?
This way, then back.
I have a question. I work for North Public School, and I'm in a high school. How do you get, like, my students who do get distracted, like, they can't even read one sentence without being somewhere else? Like, how do you go about to getting their interest in something?
Is it for Wendell or for me?
Well, for both of you.
Okay, go first.
I would probably, I mean, so, I have no advice. And generally I try not to give advice. But, you know, one of the most important courses I've taken in my, I don't know what, 20-something years of school, right, through the PhD, was one of the last courses I took, right, in which the entire semester, we read 2 words. Right? 2 words the entire semester. Right? So that we're talking 15 weeks, and we got to 2 words, right? The goal was to read a paragraph, right? And this particular instructor, he says, you know, well, often, we would do about a sentence or so. But he said, this class was special. You only got to 2 words, right? And the thing about the class, ultimately it was called Reading in Theory. The professor was Gil Anijar at Columbia. And it wasn't about the specific text we were reading, right? And it wasn't about how to read per se, but it was actually this experience, right? This, it was almost an initiation, right? And it was this really weird and bizarre scenario. But to this day, I can almost recount to you what happened every single week in that class, right? What people said, it was just so vivid and it stands out because it was so different from anything else that I had encountered in so many years of school. And in one of the last classes, we had a kind of debriefing about, okay, what was this course? What was this experience? And here I think the key word was that the class wasn't just a class, it was an experience that wasn't reducible to content, right? What was this experience? And someone used the language of, well, it was an antidote, right? It was an antidote to the kind of very rushed process, the pressure of covering material. Now, I know in public schools you have mandates. You have a curriculum that you got to cover, so I don't know how you would, simulate something like that. But ultimately, I think, creating a emotionally significant experience is a way to kind of activate people and get them to focus.
Yeah, I'm thinking there's a book by this woman named Zaretta Hammond where she talks about, it's called CRT and the Brain, where she's thinking about closely responsive teaching as engagement with neuroscience and cognition. And I think one of the really exciting things about that text and people who are doing research around cognition and neuroscience as it relates to education is recognizing that many people can't read. And I'm saying this not in like a funny ha-ha way, but like many folks are functionally illiterate. And I'm saying that not as a way to shame people, but to say that you can't enjoy the process of reading, or you can't get a reward from reading when all of your cognitive energy is being spent trying to get through the sentence. And so I think there's something for me of like, what does it mean to actually create a society where people are illiterate such they can't enjoy the reading process? When I was a high school teacher, this is something that was like the most hard. I had 18, 19-year-old students who could not read. And so the idea of trying to get them through a sentence, it was like, yeah, they're not gonna do that because by the time they get through that sentence and trying to process what is in that sentence, they don't even have a moment to actually reflect on how it connects to them. But they've used up all their cognitive energy just for the task of decoding. And so this is, my answer is more so like, what does it mean to create a literate culture as like as a primary like substrate upon which we all operate, and then to also think about like what's the reward for doing it. And I don't mean reward like you get a good grade, but like I remember being a kid loving reading because there was a sense that when I got to the end of the story, something new would be acquired or something new would be possible. But I think that we have like a dopamine issue where kids are trying to get their dopamine hits as quickly as possible, and I think that sort of fused with poor literacy in this country makes a really bad recipe in terms of kids like sustaining their attention. That was probably not helpful at all, but I at least just wanted to be honest. I don't think there's an easy solution. I think that, yeah.
The reason I ask is because I come from a country where you can't get an education. And if you try to pick up a book, they beat you. I got scars from head to toe because I tried to read one sentence and they didn't want that for women to learn to read. So that's why I try to help my students with Newark Public School because they don't know how important education can be. You know, that's why I asked that question because I don't have to work there. I choose to work in the school to give back in my community. So all I ask them to do is take their education and help with them where they live. You know, because based on my family and background and culture and things like that, my grandparents and great-grandparents wasn't allowed to, like women can't control money, they're not allowed to sign papers, they're not allowed to go make decisions for anything. There are people here now still in this country, like Jersey City, New York, certain areas, that still live under a man telling them what to do when they don't have freedom. So it still go on till this day, and the kids here need to learn about that. And you know, we have to try to do better than what the school is doing for them. Because a lot of kids just go to school, they'll think they don't need it. So that's why I asked the questions, how we could better help them.
I'll also just add this, which is, I would make the argument that much of public school experience for marginalized folks is deeply traumatic. And I think that in a lot of ways, one of the hardest things for me to accept has been that by the time I get a 16-year-old in my class, that child has been through the ringer in terms of how they have related to their learning. And I think that with that being said, there's a different type of question to be asked around like why has it gotten this far? But it's a longer answer. I think what I'm trying to say is that I'm interested in like the full spectrum of conditions that produce or create a situation where kids don't care about school. Because I instinctively believe that people want to do better. I definitely believe that people want to have better for themselves, but there is something in particular about public schools for marginalized communities that makes schooling traumatic. And I got to escape. I went to a private, wealthy Catholic school that had its own trauma, but I didn't have to go through a very particular set of things that like my cousins went through as like black men in schools in California, which was very different than what I experienced as a black woman at a very elite school. So I think we're not gonna answer this in the next 30 seconds, but I just wanted to at least offer that sort of like contextual thinking, at least for me.
So thank you so much for that. This has been quite a journey through your work and your mind, at least those parts of it that you're allowed to be transparent about and just open with us. And I just really enjoyed it. I really want to thank you deeply, profoundly for making me feel so validated in this work of the exhibit and just connecting.
It's a beautiful exhibit.
Thank you so much. So please join me in thanking Kameelah, Janan, Rasheed, and for sharing this wonderful work.
Take cookies when you leave.
I was just gonna ask, which my said some things I don't remember saying before. Thank you. I know, I listened. I said,
Yeah.